There is a question that nobody in the government wants asked out loud. A question that exposes something so fundamental about how Britain is being run right now that the entire political class has an interest in keeping it quiet. And Kemi Badenoch asked it anyway. Who is actually in charge? Not in the constitutional sense. Not the textbook answer about the Prime Minister leading the cabinet and setting policy and being accountable to Parliament. The real answer. The answer that explains why your energy bills are still rising. Why North Sea drilling sits frozen while Norway pumps 49 wells. Why a Prime Minister with a 174-seat majority stands at the dispatch box and tells the country that decisions affecting millions of households are not his to make. The answer, based on everything that has happened in this Parliament, is Ed Miliband. And Kemi Badenoch just proved it. At Prime Minister's questions, she asked Starmer directly whether he would approve new drilling licences for the Jackdaw and Rosebank gas fields in the North Sea. 2 fields, already identified, already assessed, already capable of producing enough gas to heat 1.6 million British homes, enough to power every home in Norfolk, Suffolk and Essex combined. Gas that could be flowing before winter, gas that would bring prices down and reduce Britain's dependence on imported energy from countries that do not have our interests at heart. His answer, that is a matter for the Secretary of State. Let that land. The Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, asked about an energy decision that would directly reduce the bills of millions of households, said it was not his decision to make, that he had no power, that the person to ask was Ed Miliband. Kemi Badenoch's response was immediate. 4 words that cut through every piece of spin in that chamber and landed like a verdict on this entire government. I thought he was the Prime Minister. Subscribe to this channel right now. What you are about to hear will not be the story mainstream media leads with tonight. They will give you the government line, the carefully managed response, the official explanation for why the Prime Minister of Britain apparently cannot make decisions about British energy. We will give you the full picture. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications because this story goes much deeper than one pmqs exchange. Let's start with who Ed Miliband actually is. Because if you are going to understand why this matters, why Kemi forcing this question into the open is so significant, you need to understand the man Starmer handed the keys to. Ed Miliband was the leader of the Labour Party from 2010 to 2015. He lost a general election. He resigned. He spent years on the backbenches. He wrote about climate change. He became, in the eyes of most of Westminster, a figure from a previous era of Labour politics, who would never hold significant power again. Then Keir Starmer appointed him Energy Secretary, and not just Energy Secretary. Reports from multiple senior political journalists describe Miliband as the most powerful man in the government, a minister who successfully vetoed British involvement when the US struck Iran from British bases. A minister whose position on North Sea drilling has been adopted as government policy, despite the Prime Minister personally facing the consequences of that policy at every pmqs. A minister who, according to sources across Westminster, operates with a level of autonomy that no energy secretary in modern British history has been given. This is not speculation. This is the operating reality of Starmer's government. And the reason it matters to every person watching this is simple. Ed Miliband decided in 2024 that Britain would issue no new licences to explore new oil and gas fields. His exact words, no new licences, full stop. And he has not moved from that position, regardless of what has happened to energy prices, regardless of the Iran war, sending costs spiralling, regardless of every economic argument that has been made against it. Norway's Labour government drilled 49 wells last year. Britain drilled 0. The first time since 1964 that Britain has not drilled a single new North Sea well. Not because the resources aren't there, not because the technology doesn't exist, because Ed Miliband decided it would not happen, and Keir Starmer has not overruled him. That is not a government making difficult but necessary green energy choices. That is one man's ideology being imposed on an entire country, while the Prime Minister pretends the decision is out of his hands. Kemi Badenoch named it directly. She stood at that dispatch box and said what millions of people watching pmqs from their homes were thinking. He is the Prime Minister. He can make this decision today. He can. He is so weak. He's the first person to be pushed around by the Energy Secretary. The chamber erupted, because she was right. And because the Labour MPs sitting behind Starmer knew she was right. You could see it. The uncomfortable shifting. The inability to mount a credible defence of a position that has no credible defence. But wait. Because this is where it gets genuinely significant. Because the Jackdaw and Rosebank decision is not the only example of Miliband operating as a government within a government. It is simply the most visible one. The one that forced Starmer to admit in public what has been whispered in Westminster for months. Think about what the National Security Council veto means. The most powerful decision-making body in British government, the room where the Prime Minister sits with his senior cabinet ministers and intelligence chiefs and military advisors and makes the calls that determine Britain's security, and Ed Miliband successfully blocked action in that room. On the question of whether British bases should be used to support US strikes on Iran, a question of war and national security, the Energy Secretary's position prevailed. That is not a minister doing his job. That is a minister doing someone else's job. And the someone else whose job he is doing is the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. Your bills are higher because of this arrangement. That is not a political argument. That is arithmetic. Gas from British North Sea fields is cheaper to process and transport to British homes than gas imported from abroad. Approving Jackdaw and Rosebank would increase domestic supply and reduce dependence on global markets that have been made volatile by a war in the Middle East. The economics are not complicated. They are straightforward enough that Tony Blair has called for new drilling licenses, that trade unions have called for new drilling licenses, that the Chancellor Rachel Reeves is reported to be privately pushing for new drilling licenses. Every economic argument points in one direction, and Ed Miliband is pointing in the other. And Keir Starmer is standing behind Miliband and calling it someone else's decision. Subscribe to this channel, because what you just heard, a Prime Minister admitting he cannot overrule his own Energy Secretary on a policy directly affecting your household bills, is one of the most extraordinary things to happen at PMQs in years. Mainstream media will contextualize it away. We will not. Subscribe now and share this with someone who is paying more for their energy than they were promised they would be. Here is the question Kemi Badenoch was really asking, not just about drilling licenses, about something much more fundamental, about whether the person the British public elected to lead the country is actually leading it. Because if Starmer cannot approve a North Sea drilling licence without Miliband's agreement, what else can he not do? If the Energy Secretary can veto action in the National Security Council, what is the limit of that veto? If the Prime Minister's answer to a direct question about energy policy is that it is a matter for the Secretary of State, what exactly is the Prime Minister responsible for? These are not hypothetical questions. They are the questions that every voter who went to a polling booth and made a decision about who should run Britain deserves answered, because they did not vote for Ed Miliband. They were not asked whether they wanted an Energy Secretary with effective veto power over national security decisions. They were not told that the Prime Minister would stand at PMQs and disclaim responsibility for one of the most consequential policy areas affecting their daily lives. They voted for Keir Starmer, they got Ed Miliband, and Kemi Badenoch is the only person in that chamber willing to say it out loud. She did not stop at the drilling question. She pushed further. She asked whether Starmer could name a single decision on energy that he had made personally, whether he had ever overruled his Energy Secretary on anything, whether there was any point at which the Prime Minister, rather than the Minister, had taken the wheel. Starmer had no answer. He talked about the government's green energy strategy. He mentioned the 2030 clean energy targets. He praised the investment in renewable infrastructure. Everything he said pointed back to Miliband's agenda, Miliband's priorities, Miliband's vision for British energy. There was no point in the answer where Starmer said, "Here is what I decided, and here is why," because there was no such decision to point to. That is the reality of this government. A Prime Minister who won a landslide majority and immediately handed the most consequential domestic policy brief to a man whose ideology has never been tested at a general election, whose position on energy has never been put to voters, and who is now implementing that position with the full weight of government behind it, while the person nominally in charge tells Parliament it is not his call. You know what that means, right? The 174-seat majority you watched Labour win is not being used to implement what Labour promised. It is being used to implement what Ed Miliband believes. And what Ed Miliband believes is that Britain should not drill for its own gas, should not reduce its import dependence, and should pursue a net zero timeline, regardless of the economic consequences for households currently struggling to pay bills that are higher than they were when this government took office. Kemi Badenoch called it the first time she asked the North Sea question. She has called it every time since, and each time Starmer reaches for Miliband as his answer, each time he says it is a matter for the Secretary of State, she is being proved right in real time, not by her own arguments, by the Prime Minister's own words. Here is what should happen. The Prime Minister should stand at the dispatch box and say, "I am the Prime Minister. I set the direction of this government. I have considered the economic arguments. I have weighed the energy security arguments. And I have made a decision. That decision is this. And here is why." That is what leadership looks like. That is what the person in that job is supposed to do. That is what every Prime Minister, regardless of party, regardless of policy, is supposed to be able to do when asked a direct question about their government's actions. Starmer cannot do it. Not on energy. Not on this. Because the honest answer is that the decision belongs to Miliband, and he gave it to him, and he does not intend to take it back, regardless of what it cost you, at the end of every month when the direct debit goes out. Kemi Badenoch is fighting to force that admission into the open, to make it impossible for Starmer to keep pointing sideways every time the energy question gets asked, to make the British public understand that the arrangement running their country is not the one they voted for, and not the one they were promised. One field, Jackdaw, up and running before winter. 1.6 million homes heated by British gas from British waters. The decision sitting on a desk in Whitehall, waiting for someone to take responsibility for making it. The Prime Minister says it is not his desk. Kemi Badenoch says it is. And until Starmer proves her wrong by actually making a decision, any decision, about the energy policy, destroying household budgets across this country, the British public should know exactly who told them the truth and who hid behind a minister to avoid telling it. Share this video with everyone you know who has opened an energy bill and wondered where the promised relief is. Mainstream media will not keep asking this question. We will. Subscribe now. Because the only way to force accountability from a government that hides is to make sure everyone can see exactly where it is hiding.